Well, Amanda, congratulations. Congratulations.
I know. Congratulations to you too. And if you're sitting here wondering, like, why are we patting ourselves on the back? Well, why not?
We made it to 50 episodes. It's a big freaking deal.
It's a huge deal, because what you may or may not know, depending on how long you've been here, Melissa was really like 7 episodes, guys, and we've killed it. And
I said when we get to 7, if I'm not feeling it, I'm gonna be like, girl, I guess we tried.
This was a fun thought experiment. It's nice to know you. And goodbye. But 50, and that's just counting the stuff that you guys here listening to this feed in your Apple Podcasts or your Spotify podcasts. That's just the shit that you get to see here. If you're a patron, it's like 50 million episodes.
I mean, honestly, it's a really, really huge milestone, especially because, it was born out of pandemic. The pandemic is almost over, and here we are still at it. And I genuinely feel like our community has grown with a bunch of super cool people who like us, who like what we have to say. I like what they be having to say. It feels like, it's just a big ass warm fuzzy. I cannot believe I feel accomplished. Dead ass.
Same.
I've been waking up to all these warm fuzzies all this week because of our special milestone. So I want to say, if I haven't said it enough, if you haven't heard me yet, please, please, please know and understand that we really, really, really appreciate your listenership. We really appreciate you telling other people about us, subscribing, linking, liking, reviewing. It's so cool.
It is. And this isn't just lip service. I know we say it a lot, but really, truly, we are over here pinching ourselves like, wow, people actually like and listen to the nonsense. My mom just called me this morning and was like, I think Happy Camper might be the funniest episode yet. She really enjoyed your misery during family camp. So...
Oh, yeah, I think that we're going to have to do more experiments with me just hating life, because you guys seem to really love it when I do. Thank you. Thank you so much. But also, this is a milestone for us, but also our podcast is 1 year old. And to celebrate the 1 year anniversary of our podcast, I invited a special guest onto the show, Andy. He's an astrologer, super talented. He did my personal reading, and after he did my personal reading, I was like, oh my God, he's got to come on the show, and he's got to get Amanda's credentials so that he can type her stuff in to her birth chart, and he can overlay them and see how we work together. Because I feel like, it was like our yearly review in our working dynamic. When you bring the accounting office into the conference room to see how things are going, and everybody gets graded.
Hated those.
Yeah, but they're good if they're creative and with an astrologer.
I would have loved it if Andy came in and did my corporate yearly review. He would be like, listen, I understand that you feel like your soul is slowly being drained out of your body every day that you come into this cubicle. But Amanda, I would have loved it. So, yeah, Andy came in and he read us down very kindly. And you get to hear how Melissa and my, what do we want to say, birth charts. We get a little bit of that separate piece, but we also get to see where we align. And is this podcast going to continue?
I feel hopeful. I
think the other thing that we need to tell them too is that you're listening to this episode where we talk to Andy, but you can also hear Melissa's birth chart being read on Andy's podcast. So when you're done listening here, shoot on over. What's his podcast called?
His podcast is called Astrology with Andy. You can find him at astrologywithandy.com. You can find him at that same handle on Instagram. And if you like it, listen, sign yourself up. Get yourself a reading. He's great. not whimsical, super direct, and really fun and engaging. So, without further ado, Amanda, roll that beautiful bean footage.
Here we go.
Well, hello, Andy. It's like I just feel like I haven't spoken to you in so long.
Hey, it's been ages. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy that you agreed to come onto our show because after I had my reading with you, I called Amanda immediately. Because one of the things you told me at the end of my reading was so illuminating for me in terms of where we would go professionally with this podcast. I don't know if you know this, but our podcast is now 1 year old.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For 1 year. Also, Amanda just had a birthday, as you know, since she sent you her information so you could do her chart. But I'm just so happy that now we could all three get together because a lot of what you told me gave me guidance and it helped me learn a lot about myself. So I guess first what we'll do is we'll introduce you, Amanda, Andy.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you. I'm so excited.
Same. Let's talk astrology.
Yes, so first we should probably find out how you got into this.
Yeah, well, so I'm originally from Argentina, and one thing I will say is that in Latin America, astrology has always been more mainstream than in the U.S., even though now I feel like in the U.S. it's becoming more mainstream. But in Argentina, at least, it's very common. You might be at a dinner party and you meet somebody who's a lawyer or a doctor or a judge, and they know their moon sign, their rising sign. They have an astrologer. Like, it's not considered something that is maybe silly or weird. And I feel like here that's shifting. But I say that because growing up in Argentina, my mom had astrology books for as long as I can remember. And I can recall being 6 years old and leafing through the book. It was a very basic book about sun signs, but I knew that I was a Gemini, and when people would meet me, that was like one of the fun facts about me that I would share. And then when I was 14, my parents gifted me for my birthday a professional reading with an astrologer. And that's when I was first introduced to the idea of, oh, I have an actual birth chart that belongs to me. And it's not just about my sun. There's other things in there. When I was 18, before I went to college, I had another professional reading. And then when I went to college, I just started buying books and reading about astrology. But I think what really then helped me is that as I got professional readings throughout college, I had astrologers who kind of became my unofficial mentors. So I would go to get my chart read, and I would be there for 3 or 4 hours because they knew that I was a budding astrologer, and they would kind of teach me things, and I would ask questions. Then cut to 2004, I graduate from college. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, so I took on an administrative job at the business school. And the woman who I shared a desk with, she had been there, working there for like 30 plus years. She knew everybody. And one day we started talking astrology, and she goes, oh, you actually know quite a bit. And because she knew everybody, next thing I know, half the business school knows that I kind of do astrology. So people are coming up to me and they're like, oh, well, do you read charts? And I remember saying, well, I'm still learning. So then I kind of cut a deal because I was in my early 20s and I was kind of struggling. So I said, well, why don't we go to lunch? You buy me lunch. And in that hour that we spent together, I'll read your chart. Because also, one of the best ways to really learn astrology is to actually start reading charts. You can read a lot, you can get the basics, but then it's actually an application that you start to learn and see even more. So I did about 100 plus charts, and then those people started recommending me to their friends. And then as time went on and I had more practice and more knowledge, I did get better. And then people started telling me, you should consider doing something with this. And then 2.5 years ago, I opened my astrology business.
That's fantastic. When you were talking about Argentina and like this is a very normal thing for someone to have an astrologer, why do you think that is? What is it culturally that that you think, you know, is it Latin America in general? Is it just Argentina, South America? What is that tie?
I think that in Latin America, people are generally more open to trying to understand the world through many different lenses, and maybe ones that aren't super linear and super structured. And it's just something that's not made fun of. And I think that here in the US, it is shifting, but at least I remember when I started learning astrology and I would tell people, I would be met with a lot of eye rolls, or people who would say like, oh, do you also read palms? And it's like, well, that's actually not the same thing at all. And I think part of it is also that part of the problem is that in order to make astrology kind of palatable or to kind of open the door for people, you have to really water it down, where it becomes about, oh, you belong to one of these 12 categories because there's 12 signs. And then for people, it starts to get so watered down that they're like, well, but what you're saying is so generic. It's not until you get a birth chart reading that you get really honed in and it's about you. And, you know, about 95% of my clients have their first ever reading with me. And what they always say at the end is, I had no idea that it went this deep.
Now, in order to receive a birth chart, what does a client have to come to you? Like, what information do they need?
Date of birth, time of birth, and place of birth. And the time is really key because the time is what ends up making your chart exclusively yours. And it's one thing if you say, I was born it was either 12:55 p.m. or 12:59 p.m. That's not a big deal. But if somebody tells me it was at some point after 4 o'clock, either 4:30 or maybe it was 9 o'clock, that's too much of a difference. Now, can I read a chart without a time? Yes, but I can only read about 70% of it. There's other things that without a time I don't have access to. So I always joke how, you know, if you start to date somebody and they ask for your time of birth, you know, shit's getting serious. It means that they want to know what's really going down.
Yeah. Okay, so somebody's given you their information. Can you give us an explanation of, like, you know, what that information tells you? I'm assuming it's like where the planets are in the sky in relationship to like your coordinates and the time?
Yeah, basically it's like taking a snapshot of the cosmos and seeing where the sun, moon, and planets were at your time of birth. And the analogy I give, because people tell me, well, what do you tell somebody in a birth chart reading? And the analogy I give is that if you imagine that your birth chart is a machine, what I look at in a chart are the factory settings. So, you know, when you buy a phone, it has factory settings, like this ringtone plays when you get a call, the text is this big or it's this font. Same thing with a chart. Now, there's some things about your factory settings that you might say, I love that about me. That's something I do really easily. That's something I do really well. In which case I would say, well, then you can kind of leave your machine running kind of like a crock pot, like set it and forget it. There's other things in your chart that are more challenging and where you might say, yes, that is something that I constantly struggle with. That is the proverbial pebble in my shoe. In which case I say, well, here's where the awareness comes in, because if you let this chart do what it wants, it will always lead you back in that direction. And once you know your birth chart, you can then preemptively and proactively kind of grab the steering wheel and be like, I know where you want to take me, but because I have that knowledge, let me get ahead of you and kind of bring you back in my direction. So that's why I always say that astrology ultimately is a tool of self-knowledge, of self-discovery, because the more you know yourself, the better actions and choices you take and make.
So with that analogy, you're saying, like, in some ways, even though the astrology is rooted really in a science, in a knowable thing. Like, we know the cosmos exist. We know where stars are aligned and where they are when they're supposed to be. Even though it's rooted in a science, you can use it like on a personal level as therapy. So like you know yourself. So like, for example, when you did my reading, there were many times throughout the course of us talking, and it felt, very conversational. It didn't feel, like a client patient kind of thing. It kind of it felt very conversational, but also I was learning a lot about myself. So I did feel vulnerable, even though I felt safe. But there were a lot of things that you explained to me about me where for so long in my adult life, I had been saying, oh, I need to work on that. I need to work on that. And then after you explained it to me, it was, oh, it's not necessarily something that I need to work on. This is literally how I'm wired. So I remember at one point you explained to me that, or I was explaining to you that at times I can come off like I'm belaboring a point and really needing to get it across and being super passionate and aggressive about a point, when to me it doesn't feel that way, but for other people they're perceiving me that way. And it's not that I'm being abrasive, it's that that's how I'm wired to communicate. And so like that, even just that alone helped me a lot. So I could see how the astrology piece of it is like personal therapy, which brings me to my next point. Amanda and I, starting this podcast, it was sort of a lot of things about the way that it came about are serendipitous. And I do believe, some things, I think that things happen for a reason, but I also think, time and place, things just line up. Maybe we live in a simulation. I don't know. Sometimes I go far deep off.
I agree with you, by the way.
Yeah. So, when Amanda and I started this, it really is a business relationship as much as it is a budding friendship. And so in order to do it, we had to, kind of just take chances. So after you read my chart, I remember picking up the phone and calling Amanda and being like, oh, no, baby, you got to get your shit read because I understand everything there is to know about me, and now I need to understand everything there is to know about you. We can compare our shit right quick so we can see how this is going to work. And so for the most part, in our year together, the podcast, just turned 1, I was thinking it would be great for you to, get Amanda's coordinates, get her longitude and her latitude, plug it right in to your little machine over there.
Before we get into that, can you explain a little bit for a skeptic why astrology works and why it is something that you could use as a tool and have it be reliable, or have it be something that, how do I want to say this? If somebody came to you and they were like, this is just a bunch of hooey, this isn't, I don't identify with my sun sign, and you would say, okay, but you're not just your sun sign, you're all of these things. Can you explain maybe what some of the different planets mean, or how they affect you, and why it's important to your human body?
Yes, and that's a really good point, because again, I think that part of what's happened is that to make astrology palatable, we've had to really water it down. And for example, as I was saying earlier, in your birth chart, we talk about your sun, your moon, and the planets. And there's also, in a birth chart, there's 4 what are called very sensitive angles. One of them is the ascendant, and that's the most popular of the 4, because that's also known as your rising sign. Most people know their rising sign. So if you just take sun signs, moon signs, and rising signs, when you take that alone, there's 1,728 different combinations. It's no longer that you're in one of 12 buckets. And then when you add all the planets, and then when you add the fact that every birth chart is divided into 12 slices, each one is called a house, you start seeing that the possibilities of what you can see in a chart are literally in the trillions. So it's no longer about, you have the same qualities of so-and-so. And in fact, somebody who was born the same date as you in the same city, but an hour earlier or an hour later, they have a different chart than you do. So it's really about making it very individual. Now, that's also why the only real way to do astrology is with a birth chart, because, and this happens a lot, somebody might say, I'm a Sagittarius, but I feel like a total Pisces. Well, lo and behold, you look at the chart and what happens? Yeah, their sun is in Sagittarius, but they have their moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars all in Pisces. They have the planet Neptune, which is a planet that corresponds to the sign of Pisces, right next to their sun. So yes, they are still a Sagittarius, but there's a heavy Pisces influence. But you wouldn't know that unless you did your chart. And as far as how it works, I think the only honest answer is that we really don't know. We can surmise, we do know, for example, that, the moon affects the tides. So perhaps there's how planetary movements affect our own energy levels. Maybe there's things that still have to be discovered. What is wild is that even people who maybe initially, they weren't full-blown skeptics, but they're a little bit like, well, all I know is like the monthly horoscope. After they have a birth chart read and I pinpoint times in their life that were significant down to the month, they start to see, okay, there's something to this.
And when you say you can pinpoint things, is it like this was a challenging time, or how specific can you get in there?
He got specific. I'm sorry. You go. He really can pinpoint things. There was I'm sorry. There was one point where I had chills because he said, okay, around this year in this time did you experience this? And I was just like, whoa, yes.
Yeah, because, for example, what you'll see is that, for example, the planet Neptune, if it's active in your chart during a certain time, it can indicate a time when you feel very confused, where you feel like you're walking through fog. You could be encountering severe deception. The rose-colored glasses come off. You could be lied to, et cetera, et cetera. And even like that's commonly a time in your life that's referred to as like the dissolution of your ego. Suddenly you're like, I don't even know who I am anymore. So that's when, if I see it in the chart, I might tell somebody, in this 18-month period, but especially in these 2 months and those 2 months. And that's what I'll say. And of course, that can play out for people in many different ways. For some people, it plays out that they suddenly, for example, might become addicted to something. For other people, it's that they find out that they've been lied to about something. For other people, it's that, after years of maybe being a doctor, suddenly that no longer did it for them. And they were like, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. I don't know what I want to be, but I don't want to do that. So it can manifest in different ways. And that's why I always say, this is not a psychic reading. It's not like I tell people, and even when it comes to forecasting, I do not tell people like, on March 23rd of 2024, a dark-haired man will approach you. Like, that's not what it is. What I'll say is, here's the landscape you'll be navigating. It's kind of like if I were to tell somebody, next weekend, there's a 90% chance of severe thunderstorms. Well, you can still choose to have the picnic in the park. I mean, you have free will. But if you know that in advance, you might say, you know what? I'm going to have an indoor gathering instead. But we all have free will. The planets don't make us do anything. The planets simply present situations to us. As an astrologer, I can definitely give guidance on what would be the best thing to do during this time. But I always make it clear you're in the driver's seat and you decide what you want to do. Because even with things, some people, when they read even things online, and they might read that say the next year is going to be really good for career. Well, you need to be doing stuff in the same way that, if I tell you, if we're driving on the highway and I'm like, oh, there's an exit here with like a really good restaurant. Well, you got to turn the steering wheel and get off the exit and go. Like, just the fact that it's coming doesn't mean that you're going to partake in that unless you choose to. So that's the thing too, that astrology is only half of it. You then have to provide the other half with your own actions.
Now, I can hear my husband in the back of my head going, yeah, but if he tells you that, then you're just going to make moves to make it happen. So how do you get around that? Do you? Does it matter?
Well, it does, because it's a lot like, astrology is all about the timing of when things begin. And we're talking about the best times to kind of plant that seed. In the same way that, farmers have to be very aware of the best time to plant certain crops, otherwise they won't grow. So, of course, there's nothing wrong with giving something your best effort. But at the same time, what astrology helps you with is where should your energy be directed? Because we all have finite energy. So it's kind of knowing that if this 8-week window is especially good for career, then that's where you really want to focus for those 8 weeks. And it's just about going with the flow, because in the same way that if you're swimming with the current, things just get easier. If you swim against the current, you can still get to your destination, but it's going to take longer. You're going to get there exhausted. You're not going to enjoy the process. So part of astrology is kind of going with the flow. So you're kind of tapping into things and not feeling like you're constantly walking, against the direction of the wind, so to speak.
And then if someone has a reading, is it a one and done? Is it something like you were saying, like people have an astrologer and you've had multiple readings for yourself personally throughout your life? So, what is the best way for someone to go about if they're interested in, getting their birth chart read? How often do they need to have it, redone?
Yeah, I always recommend to my clients no sooner than 12 months, because if you come see me 2 months later, I will be telling you the exact same stuff, but no later than 18 months. And the thing is that, truthfully, with a birth chart, I can, if you just allow me, I can talk about it for 6 hours. But A, that's exhausting. Nobody wants to do that much. And also, there's a limit to how much you can take in, which is why also when I do my readings, they get recorded, because I want people to listen to them 6 months later. A lot of times you listen back to it and you're like, I don't even remember him saying that. But in the same way that, you don't go to the dentist once. You don't go to the doctor once. It's an ongoing thing. There's a maintenance aspect to it that is also important. And what I also want to add is that I always tell my clients a birth chart reading is supposed to be kind of collaborative. And what I mean by that is I do not do the kind of astrology where you just sit there and I just talk at you. And some people say, well, but if I start talking, then you're going to know things about me. Well, in the 15 minutes before a session, I'm preparing. I already know what I want to talk about. And the whole thing of I don't want to say anything because then you might know. It's like, well, but that would be like going to a doctor and just saying, my stomach hurts. That's all I'm telling you. Don't ask me any more questions. Just my stomach hurts. Figure it out. It's like, well, but they have to ask you questions to kind of really be able to help you. And in the same way, I have to get a little bit of information of where you are on your own journey, so I can determine where are you in your process, and then it'll be much more fruitful for you. But I already know the things in your chart that I want to talk about. It's not like somebody's going to tell me something and then I go, oh yeah, by the way, that's in your chart too. And also that wouldn't be good business for me, because if I start, if people sense that I'm just bullshitting them, they're not going to refer me to somebody else. And after 3 months, I won't have any more clients.
Well, okay, so that brings up my next question. How, when I think of like a psychic medium or somebody reading tarot, there's a history of charlatans, right? So
yes.
What do you need to look for when you hire an astrologer? Are there red flags or things that you should ask beforehand?
So to me, there's 5 qualities of a good astrologer. I would say the first one is being empathetic, being sensitive to the feelings that a client is sharing. I always say, yes, astrology can be very therapeutic, but I'm not a therapist. And I'm also not here to tell you how to live your life. So if an astrologer starts telling you that what you're feeling is wrong or so-and-so, that's a red flag. So I think empathy is really good. I also think an astrologer that empowers you, that gives you the information so you can make informed choices and doesn't victimize you. Also an astrologer that explains things well without jargon and that isn't just going down some random path. There's some astrologers, you go see them and they go on a rant about politics, or they talk about, when I was dating a person, and then you're like, it's not about you, girl. Like, it's about me. It's my time. So yeah, that to me, and I've had astrologers do that to me, and I never go back to them, because it's like, we just spent 30 minutes of my session talking about your relationship 20 years ago. Like, that's not good. And also, an astrologer should not project their stuff onto you. And also, I think an astrologer should be prescriptive, meaning that you should always walk away from an astrology session with kind of like a to-do list of, okay, now I know how to manage this the next time it happens. Or now I know that the next time maybe I get triggered and I think this, I need to try to think more in that direction. So you should be able to walk away with insight, but also an understanding of what it is that you need to work on. And I think if an astrologer checks off those boxes, then they're a good match for you. But it's also kind of like finding a therapist. I do astrology my way. It's very direct. It's very practical. I'm not very whimsical with it. Some people might need somebody who's more whimsical. That's not me, and that's okay. I'm one of many in a sea of astrologers. You find the one that works for you.
So to piggyback on what she was saying, we've had a guest on the show before who is a medium, and one of the questions that we had was, how did you discover your gifts or your talents? And here you're saying you did sort of have a predisposition as a child because it was in your house. It was talked about regularly. It was a part of your culture. But then also, you were very young, and then it just kept cropping up, and it was an area of interest for you for your whole life. So do you think that there also is a piece that someone could discover, a piece inside them that is naturally inclined to understand this stuff and to be able to prescribe the way that you do?
Absolutely, because I do say anybody can become an astrologer. It's not like I'm like, well, I was born with a gift, and if you don't have it, then too bad for you. Anybody can do this. But at the same time, there has to be a natural appreciation for it, and just, I guess, a natural skill set. In the same way that technically anybody could be a lawyer. It's not like you have to be born with the gift of law, but there's some people who take to it like a fish to water, and boom, they're there, they love it, and they just gravitate to it. And there's other people who maybe think about being a lawyer, and then they start looking, they're like, forget it, not for me. So I do think there has to be an interest, and a lot of it is there has to be an interest in there's a lot of psychology in astrology. Again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, but Carl Jung, who was a famous psychoanalyst, a lot of the archetypes, the idea of archetypes, he really combined psychology and astrology, for example. So there has to be that curiosity, and also you have to be somebody who is okay with understanding that in astrology, you never stop learning. I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm still learning things. It's endless. So, if you're somebody who just wants things to be very cut and dry, I mean, there are things that are very... Let me put it this way. One thing I like about astrology is that it does have a solid knowledge base. What I mean by that is Mercury is a planet that rules speech and communication and short distance travel and appliances and how you learn and how you write. Every astrologer knows that. So it's not like one astrologer will say, no, Mercury is a planet of love. And one will say, no, Mercury is a planet that rules discipline. So the nice thing is there is a common thread here of what it means, but then each astrologer does add their own little twist to it. And I add a twist of fabulosity.
Okay, so it's like cooking, really.
Yeah.
You have a foundation, you have a skill set, and it's really in your application. So, your mac and cheese is going to be fantastic, whereas mine, it's edible.
And that's a great analogy also for a birth chart, because what I tell people is a birth chart is a lot like cooking, because we all have the same ingredients in our chart. We all have a sun, a moon, and 8 planets. What differs is the ratio. How much of each do you have? And, and the style that you're going to do. If you look at different cuisines, there's many world cuisines have the same ingredients, but they use different spices, and you have a totally different dish. And that's also the one thing I like about astrology is that because we all have the same things in our charts, astrology can be the great equalizer. Because when you have a Neptune transit, Neptune doesn't care about your race, your ethnicity, how much money you make, none of that. And it can be very humbling sometimes to be like, oh, wow, you went through a Neptune transit and that happened to you. That also happened to me. And I think it's a nice reminder, and not to get super cheesy here, but it is a nice reminder that we all kind of as a human race have a lot in common and a lot of common experiences. And that's one thing that I think astrology helps to remind us of.
Okay. So now that we understand the basics,
now let's get to the real shit. No, just kidding.
I was going to say, read our shit, but do it nice, not like CoStar.
So here's what I like to do. We're going to talk about your Sinistry and also your Composite Chart. So Sinistry is when I take two people's charts and I compare them either side by side, or I basically lay them over one another. And we can talk about, oh, this is hypothetical, not about your chart, but for example, oh, your sun does this to my Jupiter, and here's what that means. So it's about what you bring out in each other. And to be clear, when we do Sinistry, you can do it for romantic partners, for friends, for business partners, for parent and child, siblings, whatever, any kind of relationship you can do a Sinistry for. And this is why it's really important to look at a birth chart, because on paper, you could say, well, Amanda's a Taurus, I'm an Aquarius. And if you look at basic sun sign, which I hate the whole are you compatible by sun sign? But if you look at that, you'll see that Taurus and Aquarius are supposedly not compatible. However, here's what's really interesting. So Amanda, because you were born toward the end of Taurus season, your sun is, so let me explain this. A birth chart is a circle because there's 12 signs. Each sign takes up 30 degrees, right? So 30 times 12 is 360. And I always feel so smart when I say that. It's like there's math in astrology. And that's as much as there's going to be for this. But you were born toward the end of Taurus. So your sun is at 29 degrees of Taurus at the very end. And it just so happens that Melissa's Mars and Mercury are toward the beginning of Aquarius. What that means is that actually, Amanda, your sun is trine 120 degrees away from Melissa's Mercury and Mars. And a trine is supportive, beneficial. So this means that your sun, who you are at your core, your identity, actually has a lot of compatibility with how Melissa communicates. And it means that embodies a relationship where communication flows really easily. It also means that because your sun is trining her Mars, you bring out the part of her that wants to actually, do things, and you encourage her and help nudge her forward. You awaken her Mars. So that's a thing that unless you did a chart and you saw that, you wouldn't know that, and you would think, well, Taurus and Aquarius won't work. And by the way, if you were born towards the beginning of Taurus, your sun wouldn't be doing that to her Mercury and Mars. In fact, your sun would be challenging or squaring her Mercury and Mars. And that can be a relationship where there is a lot of misunderstanding each other. And the way you go about doing things, I don't like it. But because your sun is at the end of Taurus, it's actually supporting those planets. Very, very helpful. And then also, Melissa, your sun is trining 120 degrees away from Amanda's Pluto. Now, Pluto is a really interesting planet because Pluto is the slowest one of all, which means that it's the most intense. Pluto rules whatever is underground, whatever is repressed, whatever is hidden. Pluto is the planet that has to do with trauma, emotional trauma. When somebody's sun trines our Pluto, it means that that person, through that person, with that person, we're able to kind of lighten up. And that person, we're able to kind of navigate our own trauma or things that are repressed in a way that helps us to evolve and move forward. So, Melissa, you play a pretty important role there, I think, in helping Amanda maybe talk about or express or walk through what we would call the Pluto shadow, the things that aren't very pleasant. And through you, she's able to, I think, unpack a lot and realize that things maybe aren't as scary or as dark as they might seem. I'm going to keep going because you both look shook, but I'm going to keep going.
I was just going to say, like, we've covered some very deep things. And in the last year since we've been talking, I don't love feelings and don't love talking about my feelings or advocating for my needs. But I have found in the last year that's been a theme that's consistently come up. And I was gifted for Christmas a session with a psychic medium, and the whole gist of our talk was that I needed to release the trauma and the pain that I was holding on to. So really over the last 6 months, it's just been constant work to try to, let go and find more joy. So yeah. Okay. So anyways.
So that's very much there. And
you're welcome. Whatever you need.
And the great thing too about the Sinistry is that there's two things that I'm going to talk about next that very much point to what you would call a karmic relationship or potentially a past life connection. And the great thing is that it's mutual in the sense that you both help each other out in this. So it's not a relationship where one person is like the almighty guru who has all the answers. If anything, it's completely back and forth. The first one is that...
Are you sure? Put them papers back on top of each other. You sure one of us is not the guru? One of us don't know every goddamn thing. Are you sure?
Well, I can give you my Venmo later, and that might
Run
change
the
my
numbers. Run it again.
So, Melissa, you have an asteroid named Chiron right on top of Amanda's IC. Let me break that down. So Chiron is an asteroid that is known as the wounded healer. And it's about emotional wounds and helping to heal. The IC, and IC is literally the letter I and the letter C, IC. The IC is one of those four sensitive angles. The other is the ascendant. And the IC is always toward the bottom of our chart. So it's considered kind of the basement of our chart and really our soul, if you will. When somebody's Chiron is either right on top of our sun, our moon, or one of these angles, it means that the Chiron person, in this case you, Melissa, plays a pivotal role in helping the other person heal. So your role, Melissa, in this relationship really is to facilitate Amanda's healing. And the IC, again, since it's the bottom of the chart, the IC is also where the fourth house of home and family begins and our formative years. So a lot of times, some of whatever might need to be unpacked from that part in your life, Amanda, through Melissa, it can really be healed. Now, conversely, Melissa, you have what's called the North Node right on top of Amanda's midheaven. The midheaven is another one of those four sensitive angles, and the midheaven relates to career and profession. And the North Node is about the things that we need to do in this lifetime in order to kind of complete our soul's quest or what our purpose is here on this planet. So what that means is that through a career opportunity that Amanda needs to unlock for you, that's going to help you, Melissa, discover your potential and really get a sense of, right, that's what I was put here to do. That's my purpose. So that's how you both help each other out in that sense.
That's so bananas because that's exactly that's fucking how it happened. Andy.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
When she says that's how it happened, and Andy, we touched on this in my personal birth chart reading is because of my previous life experience and what I had, traversed through. There were elements of that trauma that kept me hidden.
Yes.
That, made me shy away from, stepping out into the light and engaging with people, talking with people. I just went inside and went super insular. And so when Amanda invited me to be a guest on her podcast, which was also, a baby at that time, her own personal podcast was new at that time as well. And she, on a hunch, on a whim, invited me to be a guest. It was a podcast about motherhood. And we started talking, and it felt natural at that time. Throughout the course of talking, we figured, oh, maybe this is a podcast, which why would I, here I am, I have not made myself available to the public in 20 years. And here she is like, hey, want to be on my podcast, which will then have us start conversations about starting our own podcast. And now here we are a year later building a real thing, building a real community. And I'm back in the world. Not that I thought that that's where I should be, but through Amanda, this push, and not a push in a bad way. I mean, like I would say in an encouragement and also kind of like a hand holding. Like I know that, maybe I was put in certain places to resonate with people. Amanda watched the shit and in her mind knew me as a friend in her head, and it became this thing. And not that, a skeptic would say, okay, you guys are trying to, fit pegs into places where they don't fit. But what you just said is really truly how it came to be. So I know that it's not necessarily astrological, but the yin and the yang to this is that I couldn't achieve the level that I needed to be in the forefront of this, like in communication and community in general, like what we're doing with the podcast, what I feel like we're building with the podcast, which sounds corny to talk about out loud, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
I feel like we're building something, and I'm using my skill set and what I have as part of my personality to help build it. I would not have been able to do that without Amanda being like, yeah, we should do that.
And the other important thing is that in your charts, your respective Mars, your Marses, if you will, are trine each other. Again, trine is supportive, beneficial. And Mars is the planet that has to do with forward movement and action and assertiveness and getting things done. So when two people's Marses are compatible, it also means that when one runs out of gas, the other one is like, I got you, and vice versa. And that's why they keep moving forward. And it's also why, if you look at just your sun and your moon, Melissa, with your sun in Aquarius, your moon in Sagittarius, Aquarius is an air sign. Sagittarius is a fire sign. And then, Amanda, you have both your sun and your moon in Taurus, which is earth. Initially it might be like, well, that's not going to work because air and fire is about exploring and being in the moment and like not too much planning. And Taurus and earth is all about really having a structure and here's what I want to do and here's a plan. But because you have all these supportive aspects in the chart, instead of being like, you're too earthy for me, or you have too much air and fire, I can't handle this, you actually have the potential and the ability to alchemize it. I used to watch when I was growing up, I used to love Captain Planet. And, each of those, like earth, fire, wind, water, and heart, individually did their own thing, but together they formed Captain Planet. And it's kind of this, where like, because you have compatible Marses and all these other things in the chart, what you bring to the table is like, when you combine it, you create something larger than each of you.
Yeah, it's crazy. I remember like when we first started talking, Melissa was like, I don't even know why I said yes to you. Or because
did I say it that rude?
No, I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, It was like, why did she say yes after years of, and people had told her, you should start a podcast. And she was always like, nah. So it is funny to hear this because it does answer that, like, why did it work out? Why did she say yes to me? We recorded for 6 months every week before we took it live. Because I was just like waiting for her to feel comfortable. So it's fascinating. Oh my gosh, it's crazy.
Yeah, and well, that's a perfect segue to then the composite chart. Because what we talked about was Sinistry, which is comparing the charts. What do I bring out in you? What do you bring out in me? Then we have the composite chart. And the composite chart is a mathematical average of both your charts. And the way to think about it is, for example, hypothetically, if somebody had their sun, person A has their sun at 1 degree of Aries. Person B has their sun at 1 degree of Gemini. Well, the midpoint of that is 1 degree of Taurus. So in the composite chart, you would see the sun at 1 degree of Taurus. We just average everything out. And in your so it's a chart of the relationship and what both people need to learn from this. What are both people getting from this? So a few things. One is that in your composite chart, you have what is considered one of the most protective and helpful and beneficial aspects, which is that Mercury, the sun, and Venus are all in a conjunction, meaning they're all next to one another. So in astrology, like I said earlier, we have the sun, the moon, and 8 planets for a total of 10 celestial bodies. And in astrology, for ease of reference, we call the sun and the moon planets. I know they're not, so don't at me and tell me you don't know astronomy. I do. I'm just doing what I need to do. I will block you. But of those 10 celestial bodies, 5 of those are considered the personal planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars. So to have 3 of them, Mercury, the Sun, and Venus, all getting along in a composite chart, what that means is that at the core of this relationship, there is understanding one another. There's genuine warmth. There's genuine care for each other. So that's always a really, there's not one thing that you look at and go, oh, it's going to be a great relationship, or no, it's not going to work. You have to look at everything holistically. But to have Mercury, Sun, and Venus in a composite chart right next to each other puts a lot of energy in this is going to be very healthy and very beneficial column. What makes it even more so in your case is that the only thing that these 3 planets are doing is trining, again, supporting, getting along with the planet Jupiter. And Jupiter is about the expansion of my world. Jupiter is the idea of the world is my oyster, and I don't just have a 5-mile radius that I can explore. I have a 500-mile radius that I can explore. So it means that for both of you, this relationship is meant to open up your perspectives on life. It's meant to open up the way that you think about life. That's one of the main things. And also in the composite chart, the moon is, again, trining. Trines, again, are just very beneficial. When you think of a trine, think of these planets are getting along, they're speaking the same language, they're understanding each other. And like if they were doing a 3-legged race, without having to communicate, they're going to the exact same destination. It's just kind of flawless. So another trine is the moon trining Pluto. The moon is emotions, and Pluto is when Pluto is trining, Pluto is all about death and rebirth, and whatever comes, it's like the phoenix rising from the ashes. So part of this relationship for both of you is also about examining your feelings, and as a result of this, coming out of it with a healthier expression of them. The only thing in the composite chart that is a little bit of a challenge, but depending on your own chart, you might be into this or not, is that you do have the moon in a square 90 degrees away from the planet Uranus. And we do not say Uranus in astrology. We're adults and we're professional, so we call it Uranus. But Uranus is a planet that Uranus is the planet that rules lightning, earthquakes, electricity, revolutions. So when it's squaring the moon in a composite chart, it does mean that in this relationship, there will be times when you will have to address things that will make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And some people are, if you're down for that, then this isn't an issue. But that's where I also always have to look at each person's individual chart. And, for some people, a very Uranian composite chart, they might be like, yeah, I'm down for that. I'm cool. Other people might find it destabilizing or problematic. But that is the one, I would say, the one place where you're going to find the most room for improvement is there.
Okay, hold on. Let me make sure we're getting this right. So, Andy, you're saying I'm in the Uranus. How do we say it?
Uranus.
Uranus.
Okay, so So, Amanda has expressed many times that she's not a feelings person, that she shies away from that. She would rather not. She's not a confrontational person. And I, on the other hand, I love it. So, in that is where we're squaring.
Well, that is where, that's where both of you in this relationship will have to learn to kind of adapt. Because, Uranus at its best is about adaptability. But when in a composite chart, when you have Uranus squaring the moon, it means that the one thing that will always have to be worked on is for each of you to learn how to adapt to the other's emotional reactions. I'm not saying it's not like it's a bad thing or a deal breaker, because again, at the core of this chart, of this composite chart, we have Mercury, the Sun, and Venus all getting along with Jupiter. But that's where the most growth is going to happen. You're both going to be a little bit pushed out of your respective emotional safe zones. But because you have Mercury, Sun, and Venus in a conjunction, that's going to happen in a way that with a lot of respect and care. And that's how you have to look at everything.
That's literally the last year and a half.
Yeah, that's it. It makes perfect sense, because I want to say early on we discovered a friction, and you know what friction I'm talking about, Amanda. Very early on, our first thing that we tried to get off of the ground, and after it, I felt like I had to explain the space I had to go into to maintain a level of professionalism, and she had to explain the space she had to go into because she was having a personal experience. So one of us was having a professional experience and the other was having a personal experience, but at the same time you could see how those lines could be blurred because we are also trying to create a friendship. And so I'm going to say, Amanda, it was like 2 days of sweating over here on my end. Yeah. And Amanda was upset for 2 days on her end, but we were not communicating because we had not yet, it was, I would say 8 months in.
Yeah.
We hadn't yet, and when I say 7 or 8 months in, I mean like at the 6 month mark of talking. So we were only launched of the podcast for 2 months, where now it is a real thing. We have bills, like we have started a business. So it wasn't a thing where we could just, let it fester, because if it had, we wouldn't have gone forward, and we wouldn't be here now on the anniversary of our podcast. So I think our workaround at that time was, we had a Slack where we have individual channels to discuss different aspects of, editing the show, promoting the show, etc. And so we created, I don't even know how that came up to be. We created a channel in the Slack called Feelings. And it was a way to where, if a person is having feelings about something that they feel like merits further discussion, if you put it in that channel in the Slack, we can then schedule and set aside time to talk about those things. Because Amanda is not a person that communicates, she doesn't love texting.
I hate it.
And I do. I love it. She doesn't love talking about things right now and in perpetuity. I do.
Right. So, and that's in your respective charts, because, for example, Amanda, in your chart, Mercury is retrograde. So you were born during a Mercury retrograde. And what that means is that, Mercury is the planet, again, of communication and processing information. When it's retrograde, people with Mercury retrograde need more time to process information. One of the worst things you can do to somebody who has Mercury retrograde by birth is give them information and say, so what do you think? Because that person goes, No, I need like at least a day. I need to process, etc. Whereas you, Melissa, you have Mercury conjunct right next to Mars. And Mars is the now planet, right, with your Mercury. So you can see how it's like, so that's something that had to be worked on, obviously. But that you can see that in each of your respective birth charts.
That's so fucking funny. I wonder if my husband's is the same as Melissa's then, because that's been like the theme of our marriage, is like he wants to solve it now. He wants to talk about it now. And we really had to come to the point where he's like, you need to come talk to me about this, like when you feel comfortable talking about this. Wow. Oh my gosh.
And I remember when she and I had our first, frictions about that, she was just like, she was like, I can't believe that I've just started a whole entire business partnership with a version of my husband. I was like,
and we also see this with your moons because, the moon is about what do I need to feel emotionally safe, emotionally nourished. The moon in Taurus, Taurus is that slow and steady energy. So the moon in Taurus is very much about I need things to be more predictable. I need a little bit of practicality. I need to take my time with things. That's Amanda. Whereas the moon in Sagittarius, which is Melissa, is much more about, well, let's just kind of move on. But the moon in Taurus is more about, well, I just need to take my time. So that was another thing that maybe had to be addressed. And that's where I think having that Slack channel is really great, because the moon in Taurus finds feelings messy. That's the issue. And the moon in Sagittarius can very easily, because, Sagittarius is ruled by the planet Jupiter. And Jupiter is the largest planet. So what can happen with the moon in Sagittarius is that things can very easily get exaggerated or get over the top. So I think when you bring in a Slack channel, for Amanda, it helps to give her feelings some structure. And then for you, Melissa, since it helps to give it also a little bit of order, so you're not in your head aggrandizing things or blowing them out of proportion. So for each of your charts, that's like the perfect turnaround.
Look how smart we are. And we didn't even know.
I didn't even know. And the other thing about the Slack is that it's immediate. So like, when I'm having feeling, Amanda will wake up and the Slack will have stuff in it at 4 a.m. and she'll be like, are you snorting cocaine? What are you doing over there? And it's just, this is such a helpful map to both our working dynamic, with it on top of our budding friendship. It's just making so much sense, because I don't know if this is true for you, Amanda, but I know when we first, started out, everybody was like, are you sure you guys can work together? Like, you just really are just going to pick up the phone every week with a stranger and think you're going to build something? And I didn't have an answer to that. I didn't.
Yeah.
But now I understand why I was able to have that forward movement, is because part of it wasn't even about me. Part of it was about, the ether.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and, and we get comments often about people really don't believe that we've never met, or we that this friendship is just happening over the phone every week. And I think that goes back to that communication and that trust.
And, Melissa, you just said a key word, because the way that I often describe astrology, whether it's when I do it one-on-one with a client or sometimes I do relationship readings, to me, what astrology ultimately does is give you a map, in the sense that, if you get dropped off somewhere without a map, you might get to your destination or find out where the hell you are, but it's going to take you a lot more effort, a lot more time. You might get really discouraged. You might even get lost. When you have a map, you still have to physically walk to the destination, and you can choose to walk somewhere else, again, free will. But if you have a map, then suddenly things just get a lot clearer. And I think that's where astrology helps. You get a sense of the landscape. And once you know the landscape, you can make better choices and more informed decisions.
Okay, wow. So now that we know all of these parts and pieces, Andy, are we going to be rich?
Well, yeah, but more importantly, am I getting a cut, and what is that?
You can be our resident astrologer.
Love it.
We are going
100%.
we'll have a monthly Imperfect Strangers horoscope with Andy. Absolutely. Payroll, yes.
Love. But yeah, I know, and that was the thing that I was talking about with Melissa, which our episode, my chart and chat with Melissa, will come out June 11th on my podcast. But that's one of the things that I mentioned to her, that just looking ahead, there was a significant career growth that was going to be very important. And that's one of the great things too about the forecasting element of astrology, is that if you know that there's going to be a time when that's coming into focus, and that time maybe is 9 months from now, that can really help, because maybe 4 months from now, if you didn't know that, 4 months from now, somebody might be like, well, if it hasn't happened by now, it's just never going to happen. But if you know that, well, actually, what you're kind of waiting for will come, but not until 10 months from now, that gives you a whole different mindset too. And then you're not missing out on potential opportunities.
Okay, good to know.
Amanda, that makes sense too, because she and I, week to week, we have, our sit down and we talk about, what we need to do to grow, and, relationships we should forge. And, outside of just our weekly editing, we had conversations where it's like, Amanda is a person that is very structured and is thinking big picture. Mm-hmm. And I'm a person that's super loose. I can get down with the structure, and I have the work ethic to get down with the structure, but I also could be like, or we could not. Right. And I remember when we first started working together, that scared Amanda about me, because she was like, she's a person that she wants to invest in this and build it. And I was just like, let's see what happens. And she's like, okay, but are you going to return my call a week from now? Like, what are we
right.
really talking about? And so this is really helpful in understanding how the two of us work, because at first I was like, okay, this girl's going to be calling me every week. It's going to be obligations and structure and this and that, and I am just like not going to be able to be my true flaky self. and then for her it was, okay, I really want to build this, and this girl is not going to show up. But the reality is we're trining all day long.
Exactly.
So the worst parts of me are circumvented by that trine.
Yes. And that's exactly it.
And the worst parts of her are circumvented by that trine.
Yes, and that's why, although as an astrologer, I always say my role is not to tell people, whether it's friends or business partners or romantic or whatever, my role is not to sit there and say, yes, this will work, no, this won't work. But what I can tell people is just to be aware that there are certain relationships that unless you're very, very willing to put in a lot of work, it's a dynamic that will bring out the worst in you. So that's where also people have to decide just how much work they want to put into something. If the astrology shows that, this is like walking on a treadmill on an incline of 11. Yes, you can walk on it, but it's an uphill climb. And that's, again, where free will comes in. So maybe the bond is strong enough between people that although things are difficult, they're willing to put in the work. And some people aren't. And that's why, also I think some people, based on their astrology, when they're 23, it's not going to work because you don't have the life experience. But maybe when you're 46, it will work, right? So it is contextual and situational. You can't just make these arbitrary calls like you will never get along, because it's like, well, when each of you's in your 20s, probably not, but maybe later on you will. So there's a lot of that as well, right? The fact that we are different people at different points of our life.
Wow.
I could sit here for hours and ask questions. Andy, if our listeners want to find you and have their birth chart, worked up, or relationship charts, why don't you go ahead and share with us where we can find you?
Yeah, my website is astrologywithandy.com, and if you click on services, you will see the many different charts that I offer. That's also where you can read my blog. I post about 3 or 4 blog posts a year, and those are more focused on global astrology. Everything has a chart, including countries. So I recently have done a few blog posts on the United States birth chart and what that's talking about. You can also follow me on Instagram at Astrology with Andy, and you can listen to my podcast, which is called Astrology with Andy, and there's a new episode every 2 weeks.
Ooh, I'm so excited to hear the podcast. I not just because it's gonna be me, but I'm just so excited to hear it in conjunction with this one. That's also going to be coming out at the same time, because when we recorded it, I hadn't yet been able to reflect at the same time with Amanda like I've done here. So it'll be nice to see how the pieces come together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or how the stars align. See what I did there? Well, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. It's really been invaluable and illuminating, and you're also just like very lovely and fun. I would eat lunch with you anytime, even without it.
Same.
Well, you better pay. You better pay. Just kidding. Thank you both for having me. It was a real pleasure, and I had a lot of fun talking with both of you.
Thank you so much for coming on. Wow.
How do you feel?
I feel like we have to play it back, and you and I got to go back and like dissect it. You know how he said that he likes to record them so that people can go back and review, because there was a lot of information in there.
Yeah, that was really fun. It was so enlightening, and I told Chris, depending on how this goes, we might have to have our chart read. Are you going to get one for you and Justin?
Oh, yeah, because Justin and I be squaring our asses off. So
I also feel like I need a shirt. This is like trying so hard.
Yeah.
Specifically for this podcast, like every time he was like, you guys are trying. I was like, we trying so hard.
Trying so hard, motherfuckers try to find us. Yeah, totally. All right, y'all. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, check out astrologywithandy.com. Get yourself your own reading. Check him out on Instagram every day. He drops little nuggets of knowledge.
Yeah.
Special for you. We follow him, so definitely give him a follow. He's awesome. He also has a blog where he talks about the birth of the United States. Actually, that's really good. So it'll help you understand the turmoil that's going on in this country and why that is based on the country's date of birth. I went through and I read it, and it was fascinating.
Oh.
So if yeah, and that's like right up my alley. You know me.
Yeah.
So if you liked it, check him out, Astrology with Andy. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. As always, you know where to find us on Monday night if you'd like to chat. 7-ish. Join us for the Monday Night Live. Amanda, where else can they find us?
Well, we have an Instagram at Imperfect Strangers _podcast. So if you haven't yet, you can jump on in there. You can check out the interactive story that goes along with this episode. And if you're just joining us, we have 49 whole interactive stories. Melissa does these guys every week, and they are always such a surprise and a delight to go in and see what she has pulled to go along. If you're on Patreon, don't forget there is close friends content for you, usually in there weekly. So don't be missing the Instagram, that little green ring. You are on the inside. We have Twitter at Imperf Strangers, and we have what else? A website. Oh my God, we have a website. ImperfectStrangersPodcast.com. You can find merch. You can listen to episodes. All of the things. And last but not least, we have a Patreon. And if you're like, what is Patreon? Patreon is where you can go get all of the extra exclusive secret things. We put a lot of work into it because we realize that these are your hard-earned dollars. And so we want to make it worth your while to be in there and say thank you for supporting the show, because that money goes into us producing this every week, whether it's equipment or, fees we got to pay. So we appreciate what?
Amanda.
What?
Speaking of equipment.
Guess
who's getting a new iPhone without a home button?
Yay! Guys, we are
it's coming next week.
Up. Welcome to 2021.
So thank you, patrons, for making this. Thank you, patrons, for making this possible. Melissa Beck is retiring her iPhone 8.
Let's have a moment of silence for the iPhone 8.
pouring out. 50 episodes. Thank you guys so much for supporting us. Thank you for listening all this time. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell your UPS driver. Tell everybody about our podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.
Bye.